Welcome back to Milligan, everyone. I hope that you're settling in and that your semester is off to a good start after a nice long winter break. And specifically, welcome back to Humanities here in the first week of Humanities 102. One thing you've probably already realized is that here at the start of this semester, we're going to be looking at the events and the figures and the movements in art and culture and history that unfolded in the late Middle Ages. And if you've done the first reading assignment and maybe had your first discussion in section at this point, one of the things you've probably seen is that this is kind of a crazy time. A lot was going on. Far from being settled and stable, it must have seemed during a time of famine and war and plague and religious controversy that any kind of order was impossible. But while times when balance seems to be shifting and culture seems to be teetering on the edge of chaos can be pretty scary. That's something I think we're all pretty familiar with, maybe especially over the last year. We also see that it's often in these unsettled times that creative thinkers manage to produce some of their most interesting and exciting and challenging work. And so today, we're going to talk about an important period in the literature of the late Middle Ages. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Italian literature, and we're going to focus on three men who have sometimes been called Italy's three crowns because of how they transformed the way people thought about Italian literature. These three men are Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Now, as I've been saying, these three writers lived and worked during a tumultuous time in European history. During the century that these three men's careers spanned, the political intrigue and religious controversies and the devastation of the plague would all leave their mark on the world in which they lived. And in different ways, these things would also leave their mark on the works that these writers produced. But these men are also significant because of the way that they lived and worked in the midst of an important literary debate. So one of the central questions that literary voices in the late Middle Ages were engaging had to do with something that we began talking about last semester, the use of the vernacular. Now, if you remember back a few months ago, Dr. Walker Eden shared with us some background on the development of romance as a vernacular literary form. That is, a literature written in the local language of a people, rather than in a classical language like Latin or Greek. And as Dr. Walker Eden told us, the romance was incredibly popular among readers. So the debate here that was going on in the late Middle Ages about vernacular literature was not a debate about popularity. It was more about whether there might be such a thing as a great literary work, that is, a truly important and enduring literary work in the vernacular, or whether a work of literature, in order to be great, had to be composed in one of the great languages of the past. Now, this might seem like a strange question for us to be asking today, since we kind of know how the debate shook out. I can imagine that a number of the great works of literature that you've read in your time as a student, or at least the works that you have been told are great works of literature, weren't originally written in Latin or Greek, but in some other more modern language, often English, or maybe they've been translated from the French or the Russian or the German. But in the late Middle Ages, this question about vernacular literature was by no means settled. So as we look at these three important figures from this period, we're going to be taking into account the part that each of these men played in advancing this debate. So the first writer we're going to look at is Dante Alighieri. He was born in Florence in 1265. And that makes him the oldest of the three writers that we're going to be looking at. And he's probably the one you're most familiar with because of how his work, especially the Divine Comedy, has affected the religious imagination of so many readers when it comes to what we think about the Christian vision of the afterlife. Some of his other works include the Vita Nuova, De Monarchia, Convivio, and De Vulgari Eloquentia. Some of these works are in Latin and some are in the vernacular. But Dante believes that the vernacular does have the potential to express great ideas. He believes that vernacular literature can indeed be great. In fact, that last work that I mentioned, De Vulgare Eloquentia, is an essay that Dante wrote in Latin, but even though it's written in Latin, it's an essay that argues for the merits of writing in the vernacular, that is, in a more modern language. Now, Dante is one of those figures whose life has always fascinated readers, even beyond the fact that his most significant work, the Divine Comedy, is pretty fascinating in itself. Dante has one of those lives that seems like it would be the plot of a really great novel or a great movie. There are so many larger-than-life elements of this figure. But at the same time, Dante is so much like us. He's a complicated, talented, ambitious, fiery, and yet very human figure. So that he's both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. And that's part of his appeal. So we're going to talk about some of the elements of Dante's life and also some of the elements of his work. And we're going to be looking at how these two things are bound up together. And of the elements of Dante's life that continue to intrigue us, we're going to focus briefly on two: his relationship to his city and his relationship, if we can call it that, to his muse, Beatrice. So let's start there with his relationship to Beatrice. The importance of Beatrice to Dante's life is first discussed at length in his first major work, the Vita Nuova. Dante wrote the Vita Nuova in his late 20s and early 30s. And it's a work that sort of alternates between poetry and prose in different passages. And it's significant for a number of reasons. For one, this is a significant work because it was written in the vernacular. As mentioned before, Dante wrote in both Latin and Italian throughout his career. But it's significant that in his first major work, that is, the work that Dante put forth as a kind of announcement that he intended to be an important poet, he chooses to write in Italian. So in this way, the Vita Nuova makes an important contribution to the debate about the potential of the vernacular. Second, this work is significant because of the way that Dante interjects himself into this poetry. To some extent, this is autobiographical poetry, or at least it's autobiographical according to how Dante chooses to remember the past. He introduces the Vita Nuova with the phrase, "in the book of my memory." And this paves the way for something that we'll see in the Divine Comedy, where Dante is the subject of his own work. In addition to the thoughts about the power of memory, this book also deals with a number of issues, such as the value of poetry and the role of the poet. But ultimately, it's about Beatrice. He talks about meeting Beatrice when he was 9 and she was 8. And he writes about the impact of the encounter. He writes the following. He says, "From then on, I swear that love dominated my soul, which was wedded to him so early, and began to rule me with such confidence and power, by means of the force my imagination lent him. There was no choice but for me to do whatever he, that is love, wanted. Time after time he ordered me to search for where I might glimpse this youthful angel, so that in my boyhood I went searching for her often, and observed that her bearing was so dignified and praiseworthy that it can truly be said of her, as Homer wrote, 'She did not seem the daughter of a mortal man, but rather of a god.'" So if nothing else, Dante seems to be articulating the belief that young love can be a powerful thing. It seems to have thrown Dante for a loop. And even though Dante would only cross paths maybe 1 or 2 more times, and even though Beatrice would die as a young woman, and even though Dante would marry and have a family, and even though we don't have evidence that he ever spoke more than 2 words to Beatrice, he will carry these impressions of Beatrice around with him until his death. As we see in the Divine Comedy, she will continue to play an important role in his work. The second great reality that in Dante's life, the one that shapes his work, is his relationship to his city, Florence. Now, in some ways, despite the fact that he describes himself as completely head over heels crazy about Beatrice, his relationship to Beatrice was kind of safe. Maybe some of you have experience with this. There's nothing safer than admiring someone from a distance, falling in love with someone that you might not actually ever talk to. As long as you never act on those feelings in any concrete way, you can't get hurt. Well, Dante had a much more tangible relationship to the city of his birth, and in the end, this relationship did hurt him badly. As a young man, Dante got involved in the politics of his city. This wasn't uncommon during the time in which Dante lived. Civic engagement, being a part of what was going on in the city, was seen as something important for young men, especially ambitious young men, to do. And there were debates raging in the Florence of Dante's time on how the church and state should interact. Dante sided with a group called the White Guelphs against a group called the Black Guelphs. The Pope, Boniface VIII, sided with the Black Guelphs. And when this group ultimately gained power in Florence, many of those who had opposed them, including Dante, faced punishment. So in 1302, when he was in his late 30s, Dante was banished from the city that he loved. Obviously, this was a decision that caused a lot of bitterness for Dante. As you read the Inferno this week, you can see some of the effects of that bitterness in the ways that Dante talks about various leaders in Florence and various leaders in the church. So that's just a little bit about Dante's life, just a little bit about his early work. Now, the work that you'll be reading and discussing in this week and into next week comes from the Inferno, which is a part of what is considered Dante's greatest achievement, the Divine Comedy. And because you're going to begin discussing the Inferno in section this week, I want to spend just a few minutes today outlining some of the things to be looking for, some of the things that make the Inferno and, to a larger extent, the Divine Comedy such a significant work of literature and such an important moment in the development of vernacular Italian literature. So let's talk briefly about some of the features of the Divine Comedy that make it so important. These are things that you're going to be wanting to pick up on in your own reading and discussion of the Inferno. First, it's most important to note that the Divine Comedy is an epic. It's an attempt, most people would say a successful attempt, to produce a great epic in the vernacular. Not only that, but the Divine Comedy is a Christian epic. So it's got a number of the features of an epic. It starts in medias res, for example. Dante opens by talking about how this poem begins during the midway point of his life, sort of a self-conscious beginning in medias res. It includes a journey, including a trip to the underworld, which is what you're primarily going to be reading about in the Inferno. But the journey that we're on here with Dante in the Divine Comedy is framed more in terms of a pilgrimage than an epic quest. And if you don't know yet what pilgrimage is all about, you'll likely be discussing it some in section, as well as hearing about it in Dr. Farmer's lecture. And the cultural significance for this epic isn't about a nation or a people group in the way that the Odyssey had significance for Greece or the Aeneid had significance for Rome. Instead, this is an epic that has cultural significance for Christianity as a community of religious belief, but also as a body of thought, a network of images and beliefs and practices. And so, as might be expected, the central figure that we encounter in the Divine Comedy isn't a conventional epic hero. It's Dante. And he's not presented as godlike or heroic in the usual sense. Instead, Dante, the central figure of this epic, is presented as a sinner, as one who has gone astray and who needs to find the right path. And so, in a way, Dante is presented as all of us. We are meant to relate to him as those on a pilgrimage toward God. As far as some of the literary conventions that make this a great work of literature, Dante is doing some interesting things in this work. The Divine Comedy is a work that is divided into three parts: the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. And there's a lot of significance of the number 3 throughout this work that I would encourage you to be on the lookout for. Obviously, within Christianity, the number 3 has a lot of significance, pointing to the Trinity as well as to the resurrection on the third day. But even as this poem is broken up into 3 parts, it also aspires to a kind of unity, much like the Trinity, because the first part has 34 cantos and the other two have 33 each, so that the whole work, all three parts, come together in a nice full number, 100 cantos or chapters. Dante also makes use of allegory in this poem. This is an important term, one that I'm sure you'll be talking about more in section. An allegory is a work, a story, a poem, or a picture which can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a religious, a moral, or a political meaning. And that's what Dante does here. Different characters and elements of this story symbolically represent some aspect of the human struggle or of the Christian life. So, for example, the figure of Virgil, whom you'll encounter in your first day of reading, will represent reason. The figure of Beatrice will represent divine grace or spiritual love. And you can be on the lookout for a number of other of these kinds of allegorical, symbolic representations throughout the poem. Now, internally, the poem follows a structure called terza rima. This consists of 3-line stanzas that form a chain. So the rhyme scheme will be ABA, BCB, CDC, and so on. You don't necessarily need to memorize that. In fact, your translation doesn't follow terza rima throughout, because the translator had difficulty finding enough English rhymes that would hold up without making the poem sound awkward. But Dante is believed to have invented this rhyme scheme and perfected it. It's one of the ways that this work, the Divine Comedy, demonstrates the capacity of vernacular literature to be great. And among so much else that Dante wrote, it cements his place in this conversation about vernacular literature in the Middle Ages and the potential of vernacular literature at that time. So let's move on to talking about our second Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was born in the year 1304. And like Dante, Petrarch was also familiar with the notion of exile, although in kind of a secondary way. Petrarch states in an autobiographical reflection that he was born in exile at Arezzo, because his father and mother had been expelled from their native city of Florence. In fact, in an interesting historical coincidence, Petrarch's father had actually been banished from Florence on the same day as Dante, January 27th, 1302, a little over 2 years before Petrarch was born. And shortly before Petrarch's first birthday, the banishment on his mother was lifted, so she was able to return with her children back to the family estate, about 14 miles outside the city. Eventually, the family would move to Avignon, where Petrarch's father would find work as a lawyer in the courts of the Avignon papacy. Later, because of his religious faith, but also because of his love for Rome, Petrarch would become a great critic of the Avignon papacy. It seems that he was even the one who coined the term Babylonian captivity of the church to describe it. But nevertheless, Petrarch spent a number of years in the orbit of that world there in Avignon, and in a lot of ways he would later come to enjoy his time there. Throughout his teenage years, Petrarch pursued a broad education. He pursued an education that consisted of such topics as logic and grammar and rhetoric. And like a lot of promising young men of his time, and like his father, he entered into the study of law at Bologna. And this was at his father's urging. But his true love was literature. And this caused a lot of tension in the family, as it often does, maybe when a child departs from his or her parents' wishes. One story from Petrarch's early years describes a fight that he had with his father about his future. And this fight ended with Petrarch's father taking his works of Roman literature and throwing them into the fire. Only a copy of Virgil and a copy of Cicero were saved. Now, whether or not that story happened just as it's told, it definitely illustrates something about how important these classical texts were to Petrarch. Most parents today, if they were that angry with their children, would maybe take away the keys to the car or ground their kids from using their iPhones. But for Petrarch, there was no punishment greater than to destroy his copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This devotion to the literature of the Roman past is going to be an integral part not just of Petrarch's story, but really of the story of his impact on European culture. But for now, Petrarch was compelled to follow his father's wishes, at least until his father died in 1326. And then he was free to abandon his legal studies. He returned to Avignon. He got a kind of a desk job in the church, and he threw himself into writing and scholarship. And at this point, Petrarch's work and the legacy of his work sort of goes in two somewhat distinct directions. On the one hand, as I've mentioned before, Petrarch has this love of the ancient classical past. Petrarch is convinced of the greatness and significance of the texts of the past, and he throws himself into studying these texts. He collects them, he copies them down, he edits them, he cleans up some of the errors in transcription that had been made throughout the centuries. Petrarch also learns Greek, but most of his work is in this regard is in Latin. And ultimately, he is committed to recovering and preserving these texts. It's because of his commitment to the texts and languages of the classical past that Petrarch is sometimes referred to as the father of humanism, or at least as one of the first humanists in Europe. It's important to talk briefly about what this means and why this is important. These authors that we're talking about today occupy a kind of transitional space. Europe is moving toward what we will call the Renaissance. We'll be talking a lot about the Renaissance this semester. And as you may know, and as you will undoubtedly find out soon if you don't know, one of the core characteristics, perhaps the core characteristic of the Renaissance, is humanism. Now, you might have all kinds of conceptions about what humanism means. And in your reading and in section, you're likely going to maybe do some work untangling some of those conceptions. But it's important to remember here that humanism is not just a term that means the exaltation of the human being. At its heart, humanism is about a commitment to the classical past, to reading and studying the texts of Greece and Rome in their original languages, to exploring and embracing the values of those cultures, to enjoying and emulating the art and philosophy of those cultures as an approach to education and formation. Certainly, the exaltation of the human being emerges out of this, but at its core, humanism is really about a return to the ideas and the texts of the classical past. So when we call Petrarch an early humanist, or even the father of humanism, this is the part of the legacy that we're focusing on. And in terms of the argument about whether great literature could be written in the vernacular, or whether the classical languages were the only proper means of expressing truly significant ideas, Petrarch would have argued against the vernacular. He believed that for literature to be great, the vernacular simply wasn't adequate. And this is reflected in his own literary career. He wrote volumes of letters, as well as other reflections in Latin. His first major work was an epic poem. It was written in Latin. It was about Scipio, the Roman general who had defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. And even though we don't read this poem much today, it was popular and acclaimed at the time. And for this epic, as well as for some other Latin poetry, Petrarch was crowned in Rome as the first poet laureate since the ancient world. For Petrarch, this was undoubtedly one of the most significant moments of his life, if not the most significant, because it would have put him in a sort of line that connected him to those great writers of the past that he admired. In his mind, it probably also gave him something of an edge over Dante. As you'll see early in the Inferno, Dante situates himself among some of those great poets. Petrarch apparently was sort of competitive toward Dante, even though he once claimed in a letter to Boccaccio that he had never even read Dante's work. There was probably some level of ego bound up with all of that, but he might also have seen Dante as second-rate, because Dante wrote his epic in the vernacular rather than in Latin. Interestingly enough, however, when it comes to Petrarch as a poet, the works that we do read most often are not his Latin epic verses, not his long epic to Scipio, but his love poems. And his love poems were written in the Italian vernacular. In fact, if you've heard the name of Petrarch before today, it's probably because you've encountered a Petrarchan sonnet, which is the form that he utilized in a series of love poems called the Canzoniere. In another interesting connection with Dante, there seems to have been a muse in Petrarch's life who inspired these poems, a mysterious woman named Laura. Like Dante's Beatrice, we don't know much at all about Laura. Petrarch writes that he saw her worshiping in the church at Avignon. But our evidence for a meeting between the poet and his muse, or even our evidence for whether this woman actually existed, is pretty minimal. But as with Dante's Beatrice, Petrarch claims to have loved this woman from afar, and she inspires some of his most enduring and most influential work. In a strange twist, these sonnets actually serve the purpose of helping to legitimize the use of the vernacular, the very vernacular that Petrarch was allegedly so much against, because of what Petrarch was able to achieve with them in terms of richness of language, but also the level of emotion that he was working with. So despite the fact that Petrarch debated the validity of the vernacular as a vehicle for great literature, these poems in honor of Laura made the vernacular great in the eyes of many readers. Finally, we're going to talk about our third author for today, and that's Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio was basically a contemporary of Petrarch. He was born about 9 years later in 1313, and the two would become great friends later in life. He was raised in Florence by his father and his stepmother. And because his father was a wealthy businessman, he had a number of opportunities from an early age to study both business and law. But he also had the opportunity to have a well-rounded education in the trivium and quadrivium, in the liberal arts. Boccaccio will eventually move with his father to Naples, and at his father's urging, this is becoming a common theme, he will study business and law, while at the same time developing a love for literature. He began associating with a group of young scholars and poets, and he became widely read, both in the Latin works of Ovid and Virgil and others, but also in the modern romances of France. After his father left Naples and moved to Paris, Boccaccio had more freedom to study literature, and he continued to grow as a humanist. Boccaccio came to admire the work of Petrarch, and maybe to an even greater extent, he really admired the work of Dante. Throughout the rest of his life, Boccaccio would be kind of torn between these two influences, so that he embraced the humanism of his friend Petrarch, and at the same time, he wanted to be a great writer in the vernacular, like his hero Dante. And Boccaccio was ultimately able to do both. He begins to develop as a writer in a variety of genres and across languages as well. In his mid-20s, he composes a series of letters in an attempt to emulate some of the classical styles of letter writing. And these letters that he writes are full of allusions to Greek and Roman literature. At times they're written in Latin, at times they're written in Greek, and sometimes they contain these mixtures of Greek and Latin phrasing, where Boccaccio is coining these new combinations of words in the two languages. And so in this, we can see Boccaccio really engaging the past as a humanist, but also playing around with these texts, playing around and having some fun with these languages. And I think this is pretty indicative of who Boccaccio would come to be as a writer and as a scholar. But even if he was interested in Latin, and even if he showed promise as a humanistic scholar, Boccaccio's greatest legacy is what he was able to achieve in the vernacular. His most important work is entitled The Decameron. And the Decameron is a series of stories set in the context of, and this will be really familiar, a group of 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, who take up residence in the country to escape the effects of the Black Death. So in a way, they're kind of a pandemic bubble traveling together, or a pandemic pod out in the countryside together. And while they're there to pass time, they tell stories. They tell 10 stories each. So the Decameron is a collection of about 100 short stories. And in the Decameron, Boccaccio not only paints a vivid, engaging picture of the world in which he lived, including a description of a society touched by the plague, a description of society that, as with so much of what we're reading and learning right now, happens to still be very resonant and relevant to us. But Boccaccio also proved to be an influence on a number of writers who came after him. While there's some debate about this, at least some scholars believe that the Decameron probably influenced Geoffrey Chaucer, whose Canterbury Tales you'll be encountering in coming weeks, and which adopt a similar structure to what Boccaccio was doing here. Because this work, the Decameron, was in the vernacular, and because it was funny and frankly also pretty bawdy, full of some some crass humor, it grew in popularity among a new class of readers, especially among merchants and other working people. But at the same time, the Decameron was and is considered great literature, so that, like his hero Dante, Boccaccio contributes to this argument that it was possible to produce significant works of literature in one's native language. Now, there is a lot more that we could say about these writers and their works. There's certainly a lot more that we'll continue to say about the way that people of this time in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance engaged classical texts and at the same time produced great literature in the vernacular. But hopefully today you've been able to get just a glimpse of how these three writers, the three crowns of Italian literature, were able to contribute to an ongoing conversation about what made literature great, while at the same time producing great works on their own, in a number of different genres, and even in a few different languages. Thanks for your attention. Hope you have a great day.